Sirens split the calm as screens flare red across the executive floor. Alexander Cole steadies his breath while headlines scream collapse. Laura Bennett said, "We can contain this if we move now." He nods, but the boardroom cameras feel like crosshairs. Mason Reed stands too still, and silence grows sharp. Victoria Hale's name trends, a rival scenting blood. Reporters flood the atrium like a tide. Alexander said, "Hold positions, freeze all outbound transfers." Laura keys commands with clenched jaw. Numbers tumble, assets blink out, and the map of their empire stutters. Mason said, "It's a systems misfire," but his eyes drift to the blackout feed. Alexander watches trust drain down the polished glass. Richard Hayes calls with a graveled warning about debts that remember. Alexander said, "I will not surrender the legacy I built." A private alert needles his phone, signed by an unseen investor. The floor hum feels unstable as the lights flicker like a verdict being written. The morning brings no relief as auditors stampede through compliance logs. Alexander said, "Pull every transaction flagged in the last 6 months." Laura threads teams across secure channels while the atrium becomes a stage. Victoria's people tease a statement that sounds like a eulogy. Mason said, "We should suspend trading until clarity returns." Alexander rejects the paralysis creeping into the room. Richard Hayes reminds him that image can break faster than truth can mend. Alexander said, "We answer with facts and motion, not fear." A legal draft flashes in and out of authorization purgatory. Anonymous tips flood their hotline like needles in cloth. The company app pings a surge of cancellations from rattled clients. Alexander tightens his tie and gives the day its terms. A leaked memo surfaces with the venom of a signature that should not exist. Laura said, "Metadata shows it routed through our internal relay." Mason calls for restraint while the board whispers thunder through private chat. Alexander said, "Trace it to the first keystroke." The security chief reports a ghost login from a retired credential. Richard texts 2 words that sting like salt: "Be careful." Victoria's media allies post a countdown to a reveal. The market opens and dips like a held breath, losing faith. Alexander said, "We will not chase smoke, we will clear it." The room tightens and silence becomes a blade. Board convenes on a secured line that feels colder than any room. Alexander said, "You trusted me with growth. Trust me now with defense." A director coughs doubt between polite phrases. Mason said, "Liquidity is our lifeline. We must negotiate with rivals." Laura signals a fresh clue, a server hop with a familiar rhythm. Richard warns that friendship and leverage rarely share a table. Alexander said, "Schedule an open briefing with investors within the hour." The line goes still, then allows him a thin mandate laced with conditions. He tastes iron resolve and moves. The investor briefing hums with the quiet menace of money deciding fates. Alexander said, "We are investigating a coordinated attempt to injure this company." Questions knife forward about governance, controls, and trust. Laura feeds him live data like oxygen. Mason said, "We have contained all known vectors," and a phrase lands with weight. A private message arrives from an unlisted number, offering help at a cost. Richard texts, "Remember who writes the last line." Alexander said, "Our legacy is not a rumor, it is a record." The call ends, leaving a vacuum that sounds like thunder walking away. Morning breaks heavy with rumors that refuse to die. Alexander Cole said, "The press is orchestrating a siege." Laura Bennett gathers reports while Mason Reed lingers silent, his phone alive with secret messages. Richard Hayes warns him that half measures fuel doubt. Investors circle like vultures, hungry for weakness. Alexander said, "We double our outreach, show presence in every channel." Laura presses updates across glowing dashboards, momentum barely clinging. Anonymous posts claim insider leaks, each word cutting brand equity. Mason said, A pause would stabilize perception, but Alexander hears only surrender in disguise. Victoria Hale broadcasts a sleek interview where she declares herself a safer bet. Alexander said, "Then we hit harder. They will not dictate the legacy." The room breathes unease, but action becomes command. The team scrambles into a crisis council as the clock hammers noon. Alexander said, "Every division head must be present." Laura calls through encrypted lines. Richard appears in a private window, voice gravel with warning. Mason said, "We cannot sustain without temporary concessions." Alexander rejects retreat, his gaze sharp like tempered steel. Data analysts show plummeting trust indexes. A marketing director says their clients are defecting by the hour. Alexander said, "We meet this storm with certainty, not panic." Laura feeds him a stream of options, but every choice tastes bitter. Silence grows like smoke as the council ends. Alexander feels the ceiling lean lower. Afternoon paints shadows long as auditors slam down demands. Alexander said, "Show them cooperation but not surrender." Laura shuffles files like weapons, fingers trembling. Mason Reed advises caution with rehearsed calm. Richard Hayes texts, "Every signature is a trap." A rival article claims bankruptcy filings loom, shaking confidence further. Alexander said, "They want collapse. We deliver resilience." The legal chief warns that one misstep could trigger regulators. Laura whispers that their liquidity buffer shrinks by the minute. Mason said, "We must open talks with Victoria." Alexander's refusal cuts clean. That will never happen. The office air tightens with heat. News breaks of a coordinated shareholder revolt by Victoria Hale. Alexander said, "She moves faster than whispers." Laura notes proxy votes swinging in her favor. Mason said, "If she secures 40%, control teeters." Alexander leans into the tension. "Then we fight for every percentage." Richard Hayes calls with bitter irony, "This is the war you wanted." Alexander said, "This is the war we win." Legal advisors draft emergency injunctions, while the trading floor trembles. Laura rallies analysts with clipped instructions, holding panic at bay. Mason's silence grows heavier, each second weighted with unseen choices. The storm sharpens its claws. Night falls with a call that strikes deeper than any headline. An anonymous voice offers evidence of betrayal from within. Alexander said, "Whoever you are, prove it." Laura stiffens, her screen flashing coded attachments. Mason Reed watches too carefully, a shadow across his composure. Richard Hayes murmurs on another line, "Trust no one, not even your reflection." The attachments reveal traces pointing inward, a hand within the empire. Alexander said, "Lock this file. Triple encrypt, no circulation." Laura obeys with a frown carved deep. Mason said, "If this is real, it will tear us apart." Alexander replies, "If it's real, it already has." Darkness seals the office like a verdict waiting to be read. The morning after feels sharper than broken glass, as whispers turn into evidence. Alexander Cole said, "This is no longer rumor. Someone is bleeding us from inside." Laura Bennett uncovers login trails laced with deliberate misdirection. Mason Reed sits at the edge of the table, too quiet, while Richard Hayes growls on the phone. Shadows never move without a hand guiding them. A leaked audio hits the press, feeding suspicion like gasoline to fire. Alexander said, "We expose the spy, or everything falls." Laura urges caution, but her eyes reveal fear of betrayal closer than imagined. Alexander steadies his breath, tasting the weight of trust fracturing piece by piece. By mid-morning, the board demands explanations for the mounting leaks. Alexander said, "We will identify the saboteur before this day ends." Laura presents packet trails showing encrypted handshakes with rival servers. Mason Reed said, "It could be spoofed to frame us internally." Alexander watches him with narrowed eyes, suspicion sharpening. Richard Hayes warns that every unanswered question tilts power toward Victoria Hale. Alexander said, "She feeds on hesitation. We cut her supply." The board murmurs unease, some ready to abandon ship. Laura whispers, "The pattern matches an old project key." Alexander answers, "Then someone trusted has turned against us." Afternoon storms drum against the windows as Alexander convenes a closed session with legal and security heads. He said, "We strip every layer until the ghost bleeds." Laura feeds patterns into predictive software, her voice steady though her pulse races. Mason Reed offers advice, but each word feels polished for effect. Richard Hayes said through video, "I have seen this play before. The enemy is never outside, it is seated across from you." A decrypted file reveals correspondence with Victoria's firm. Alexander said, "Then it's confirmed. We have an infiltrator." The truth feels like a blade cutting into loyalty's skin. The rival's fingerprints are undeniable as Victoria Hale hosts a public press event, her voice velvet and cutting. Alexander said, "She wields our wounds as spectacle." Laura clenches her jaw, streaming the feed live. Mason Reed said, "She's baiting you to overreach." Alexander answers, "Then we meet bait with fire." Richard Hayes sighs, "You're walking into a trap you can't afford." The investors watching the feed call for leadership that bleeds confidence. Alexander said, "Confidence is earned by striking, not hiding." The storm outside howls, echoing the turbulence within. The betrayal breathes louder, shaping itself into form. Night deepens, and with it comes a private breakthrough. Alexander said, "The trail leads to someone embedded, closer than the boardroom." Laura whispers, "We trace the handoff to encrypted calls made after midnight." Mason Reed averts his gaze, murmuring about false flags. Richard Hayes warns, "The real betrayal is always dressed as loyalty." Alexander feels the air thicken with inevitable confrontation. He said, "We tighten the circle. Tomorrow, names will be spoken." Laura nods, resolve burning under fear. The city's skyline outside blurs under heavy rain, as if the world itself recoils from the truth about to surface. The day begins with sharp edges, as rumors tighten their grip. Alexander Cole said, "The revolt will grow unless we fracture it first." Laura Bennett reports a spike in proxy support for Victoria Hale. Mason Reed offers calm words, "Negotiation could diffuse this." Alexander's stare cuts across the table like steel. Concessions feed predators, not allies. Richard Hayes warns that even loyalty cracks under constant pressure. Alexander feels the weight of suspicion heavy on Mason, but his proof is still smoke. Laura said, "An underdog within operations flagged unusual trades." Alexander answers, "Bring them forward, no one hides behind shadows." The fight for truth gains a new voice. The underdog emerges, an overlooked analyst with piercing insight. Laura said, "Ethan Clarke traced trading anomalies tied to internal access." Ethan said, "The pattern points inward, not outward." Alexander studies him, impressed by clarity hidden in youth. Mason Reed masks irritation. Data without context misleads. Richard Hayes warns, "Trust often comes packaged in the unexpected." Alexander said, "Ethan, you are now part of this circle." The revelation stirs new energy in the war room, though it deepens the divide. Laura sees promise in Ethan, while Mason hides his unease behind silence. The tide shifts subtly, power realigning its course. The afternoon darkens with board chatter about surrendering to Victoria's pressure. Alexander said, "We will not fold before traitors." Laura urges caution, noting risks of direct confrontation. Mason Reed counters smoothly. Stability demands compromise, not war. Ethan Clarke adds, "The data reveals intent to corner us before quarter's end." Richard Hayes laughs bitterly. "Victoria plays chess, and you argue about checkers." Alexander's fist strikes the table, then we seize the board itself. Silence falls heavy, revealing fractures. Laura meets Ethan's eyes, seeing new strength rise where old trust decays. The war sharpens into a duel of convictions. As dusk falls, Alexander summons Laura, Mason, and Ethan into a sealed chamber. Alexander said, "Only truth binds us now." Laura reveals further evidence of internal leaks, narrowing on trusted credentials. Ethan said, "The anomalies align with specific late-night sessions." Mason Reed says smoothly, "False positives are dangerous in moments like this." Richard Hayes cuts in cold, "A guilty man always fears illumination." Alexander replies, "Fear won't save us. Exposure will." The room thickens with tension as each word sharpens suspicion. Laura's eyes dart between Mason and the evidence, while Ethan stares at Mason with quiet certainty. Night settles heavy as the board calls an emergency summit. Alexander said, "We face a choice between surrender and survival." Laura notes that investors lean toward Victoria's promises. Ethan Clarke warns, "The betrayal is real, evidence points within." Mason Reed said, "Accusations fracture unity, not mend it." Richard Hayes growls, "Better fracture than rot from silence." Alexander's voice cuts final, "Tomorrow we strip this to bone, and the betrayer will stand revealed." Silence follows, deep and suffocating, broken only by the rain hammering glass. The empire trembles, suspended on the edge of exposure, betrayal, and reckoning. The morning cracks open with board members filing into the grand chamber, their faces tight with hidden agendas. Alexander Cole said, "We face an empire under siege, but it is not yet lost." Laura Bennett displays graphs that plunge like a nosedive, her voice controlled though her pulse races. Mason Reed mutters, "A merger with Victoria Hale could restore stability." Ethan Clarke interjects sharply, "That's surrender dressed as strategy." Richard Hayes calls in from a shadowed office, "Every concession writes your obituary." Alexander slams his hand on polished wood, "Then no concessions, no surrender, only survival." Silence folds over the chamber like a shroud. By noon, pressure mounts as investors demand clarity. Alexander said, "We answer with strength, not fear." Laura whispers, "Liquidity reserves drop below safe margins." Mason Reed seizes the moment. "Victoria offers bridge financing if we yield control." Ethan Clarke said, "That's a knife hidden in velvet." Richard Hayes warns, "History punishes those who trade freedom for comfort." Alexander steadies himself, eyes locked on Mason. Control once lost is never returned. The atmosphere feels electric, alliances snapping under the heat. Laura grips her tablet tighter, her loyalty unshaken despite the storm. Afternoon descends heavy as a secret memo leaks, alleging fraud under Alexander's watch. Alexander said, "It's fabrication designed to erode trust." Laura hurries with forensic evidence to disprove it, her voice breaking with urgency. Mason Reed remarks, "Perception often outweighs truth in business." Ethan Clarke fires back, "Convenient words for those with something to hide." Richard Hayes growls, "Expose the snake before it poisons deeper." Alexander's resolve hardens. "We go public with the evidence, clear and uncompromised." The team feels the floor tilt as loyalty fractures further. Shadows of betrayal creep nearer, feeding uncertainty like fuel. As dusk settles, Alexander calls an emergency investor broadcast. He said, "We will not bend to falsehoods." Laura feeds verified numbers to the display, hands steady though heart races. Mason Reed interjects, "Transparency risks further panic." Ethan Clarke said, "Silence risks complete collapse." Richard Hayes mutters, "Every empire falls to its weakest link." Alexander stares down the lens, voice iron. "This company is not for sale, not for surrender." The boardroom echoes with a hush, heavy enough to crush bone. Outside, Victoria Hale prepares her countermove, waiting for cracks to widen. Night falls, and Alexander confronts his team in a sealed chamber. Alexander said, "Someone among us is orchestrating betrayal." Laura freezes, her eyes darting to Mason. Ethan Clarke drops a file. "The encrypted calls lead here." Mason Reed replies smoothly, "Accusations without proof destroy faster than enemies." Richard Hayes hisses, "Proof is a mirror. Look close and you will see who blinks." Alexander said, "Tomorrow we bring names into the light. No more shadows." Silence grows unbearable, suspicion thick as smoke. Outside, thunder cracks across the city, as though the world itself prepares for reckoning. Dawn breaks, but no light reaches Alexander Cole's mind as the betrayal finally sharpens into truth. Ethan Clarke said, "The encrypted calls all linked to Mason Reed." Laura Bennett whispers, "It can't be. He was our shield." Mason lifts his chin, eyes cold. "I did what had to be done." Richard Hayes' voice burns across the line, "You sold them the keys to the kingdom." Alexander's fists tighten, rage simmering. "You dismantled my legacy for profit." Mason answers smoothly, "Your empire was rotting. I only accelerated the inevitable." Silence falls, heavy and violent. The betrayal is no longer rumor. It is flesh and blood. The confrontation spills into the board chamber, where allies await an explanation. Alexander said, "The betrayer stands among us, no longer hidden." Laura shows the proof on the screen. Every timestamp, a dagger. Mason Reed interrupts, "This is fabrication, a desperate play." Ethan Clarke fires back, "The trail is undeniable." Richard Hayes hisses, "I warned you, loyalty cloaks treachery." The board erupts, voices colliding, some siding with Mason, others recoiling. Alexander said, "Choose now, loyalty or ruin." The storm outside batters the glass, echoing the chaos within. The chamber becomes a battlefield of words sharp enough to wound. By afternoon, Victoria Hale strikes, announcing her bid for hostile takeover backed by Mason's betrayal. Alexander said, "So this is your endgame?" Laura mutters, "She holds nearly half the board already." Mason replies, "Better her leadership than your crumbling throne." Ethan Clarke slams a fist, "You traded integrity for scraps of power." Richard Hayes whispers bitterly, "The wolf finally showed its teeth." Alexander breathes deep. "If she wants a war, she will have it." The announcement spreads across media like wildfire, rattling markets, poisoning confidence. Every second bleeds the empire thinner. Yet Alexander refuses to collapse. As dusk falls, Alexander gathers his inner circle, fractured though it is. He said, "The empire bleeds, but is not dead." Laura insists, "We can rally investors if we expose Mason fully." Ethan Clarke adds, "Proof of collusion with Victoria will sway the undecided." Mason sneers, "You'll drown before you swim." Richard Hayes growls, "The tide has no pity for traitors." Alexander steadies himself, "We strike at her power tomorrow, even if it costs me everything." The group falls silent, each face carved with exhaustion and fear. The storm outside roars, a mirror of the chaos within. Night descends with the empire trembling at the brink. Alexander said, "Tomorrow we face her, and tomorrow decides legacy or ashes." Laura whispers, "We stand with you, no matter the cost." Ethan Clarke nods, resolve etched sharp, "Betrayal ends here." Mason Reed smirks faintly, "You can't win against inevitability." Richard Hayes answers, "Inevitable is only what men accept." Alexander lifts his gaze to the storm outside, voice low but steel forged. "I built this empire from nothing, and I will not watch it die without fire." Silence grips the room as thunder rolls like a drumbeat of war. The morning sun rises weak behind storm clouds as the final board confrontation begins. Alexander Cole said, "This is the hour where truth stands alone." Laura Bennett displays evidence, her voice steady though her hands tremble. Mason Reed counters, "Your obsession with power blinded you, not me." Ethan Clarke interjects, "The proof is undeniable. You sold the empire." Richard Hayes said through the speaker, "Every betrayal carries its own noose." Alexander glares across the table, "You chose greed over loyalty." The chamber falls silent, tension snapping like wire. The legacy teeters on the edge of collapse. By midday, the board erupts into chaos as Victoria Hale enters with her entourage, radiating victory. Alexander said, "You will not inherit what you did not build." Victoria smirks, "I inherit what weakness surrenders." Laura whispers, They have the votes. Ethan Clarke said, expose Mason now, or it ends. Alexander releases the final proof, encrypted logs tying Mason directly to Victoria's camp. Gasps ripple through the chamber. Mason said coldly, better her empire than your ruins. Alexander said, then you'll fall with her. The balance begins to shift, loyalty cracking wide open. The vote begins, every raised hand a blade at Alexander's throat. Laura murmurs, we're losing them. Ethan Clarke whispers, wait. The underdog presents the hidden clause from the corporate charter, revealed in encrypted files. Alexander said, control cannot transfer under collusion. The chamber stills, the weight of law bearing down. Mason Reed shouts, you can't twist words to save yourself. Richard Hayes chuckles darkly, words built this world, and words undo it. Alexander lifts his gaze, legacy bends but does not break. The room shifts, eyes turning uncertainly toward Victoria. As dusk approaches, the board splinters. Some shift back toward Alexander. Others cling to Victoria's promise. Alexander said, this company's blood was built on sacrifice, not betrayal. Laura's eyes burn with loyalty as she said, they cannot erase what was forged. Ethan Clarke steadies the moment with clear words, we must vote again under the law. Mason Reed snarls, this ends tonight. Victoria Hale leans forward, voice dripping venom, then may your empire choke on your pride. Alexander said, better pride than surrender. The tension slices the air as dusk shadows spill across the room. Night falls as the final vote concludes, Alexander standing alone in silence before the tally. Laura whispers, it's enough, we survived. Ethan Clarke exhales relief, the legacy holds. Mason Reed storms out, venom in his eyes. Victoria Hale smirks faintly, retreating with a promise of return. Richard Hayes mutters, victory always costs more than you think. Alexander gazes at the city beyond the rain-streaked glass, voice low, the empire breathes, but it will never be the same. The chamber empties, leaving him in solitude, a man surrounded not by allies, but by shadows of trust burned away.